So we have come to the part of the evening where we do the Q&A. Okay, brilliant. So let's get started. I'm going to jump straight in there. This is clearly a question for NewsKit. How big is the NewsKit team, and what's the makeup of the team?
Oh, yeah. I was looking for your microphone, but obviously I don't need it. So yeah, we've obviously got everyone pretty much here, most people. I think we've got around, looking at my boss.
Better not get it wrong.
Yeah, we got 5 designers. We got more engineers than that as well. And obviously product people. So yeah, fairly big team actually.
Fantastic. And I also know for a fact that you have a product manager or product owner for the design system?
Yes, we do, yeah.
I say that because for some people that might sound obvious, but for a lot of people that is very, very much not obvious. And so if you're like me, when I first heard that, I did cast some jealous eyes over thinking, wow, that's a team that have their own product owner for the design system. So yeah, excellent. That's awesome. So that's a little bit about that setup. This is another one again. So you guys, I believe that you guys are recruiting design system advocates at NewsKit. Is that true? Or is that just a rumor?
No, not just a rumor. No, we look for people designers in different product teams.
Yeah.
So they are sort of like the champions, as it were, in those individual teams. They work with our team directly and we support them, but they're sort of like the, say, gatekeepers almost.
So how do they support you guys with bringing the design system forward?
So we do have a community library we're looking to roll out. So the idea is that we have a bit of an open sort of forum where people can add components and stuff like that, and maybe we can end up bringing them back into the system. So bringing that knowledge back.
Excellent, brilliant. So this one, I guess, is a little bit for you, but I think this is actually a very interesting question for everybody. So the research, the stuff that gets done, how do you share the insights just for the team? Would you also share it to senior stakeholders? The things that you sort of find out through that research, how is that shared? Do you want to start with it, or?
Yeah, I can start.
Go for it. Yeah.
So, like I said before in my talk, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with other people. Obviously, there are people within the team that have more insight and they have more context as well. And obviously, different people make different decisions. So yeah, it is important, obviously, to share that with senior leadership as well.
Excellent. And Riccardo, do you have?
Yeah, we started for a bit to also do a bit of survey internally for the front-end people in my company that are actually consuming the components. That was not very successful. There was not many of them. So we started to do office hours right now. So every couple of weeks, we actually, everyone in the team show up in the call and everyone can just ask questions. And we share for example, also our review notes, what we worked on. So we try to not stay isolated as a team. So we are there for them to, help and also to receive criticism, because, then we actually say in the meeting is not for us to show off about what we do, but it's for them to come.
It's a little bit like that.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, but it's also for them to come and say, okay, this component is confusing. Why? Can we change this component? I want this, I want that. It's kind of a way to, they see us as kind of we want to help them. We're not just dictating stuff to them. And I think it's quite important. It's been quite successful since we started that.
Amazing. So I think that's sort of almost a bridge to a question which is actually directed at you here, Mitchell, which is about the communication between designers and engineers. Mm-hmm. So even if it's not necessarily about feedback, it's sort of a handover process. You talked about it, but what are some key things to ensure that handover is smooth?
For communication, well, having the right line of contact with the designer you're working on, ensuring those Slack channels are updated, people are communicating, and just ensuring the documents are correct. I mean, a lot of times if they're not correct, that's when communication dialogue opens. And obviously, what I was saying in my talk was to reduce that communication layer, reduce the amount that you have to go backwards and forwards and discuss things. So if you make it in a way which allows people to communicate easily, you'll find that you'll have less communication overall.
Excellent. Do you guys have any input on how do you make that communication between the various teams?
So I can say from more as a designer, obviously, going out there and sort of meeting an engineer a bit more, you know, with the handoff that you do, and Figma's made that a lot easier as well. I've seen from a guy from Figma over there, probably happy to hear that. But yeah, by sort of bridging that gap a little bit more, and you know, meeting someone more than halfway, I think is important.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think like what Mitch had said, like having, you know, I mentioned office hours, but also we have a Slack channel that's just like for people to ask things and kind of like, and we always have like someone, not on call, but there's always like someone potentially ready to jump in and help from the design point of view and from the developer point of view, because sometimes we're designer, they don't understand the decision that were made before they joined, and sometimes we have developers who don't understand how a component should work once they try to consume it.
Yeah, makes total sense. I think I saw a tweet from somebody who may or may not be in this audience today. They said one of the issues could be that designers and engineers don't always understand what the other person is capable of doing. And if I have misquoted that tweet, I'm not looking at anybody, so apologies, but I thought that sort of goes in line with that. So you mentioned, Mitchell, about style guides and reading, and obviously this is part of like documentation and making sure that communication is working. But how can we actually encourage or enthuse engineers to read and follow the style guides?
Well, what I said was actually really important. If you make it less than 5-minute read, I can assure you that the developer will use it, because I've seen, you know, style guides where it's like 20 pages long. I don't have the time to do that, I'm sorry. But if it's like 5 pages, I can read through it very quickly. It's, you know, that's usable, and people will use it and will remember it and will go back to it.
Excellent. So I also know that documentation is one of those things that actually in our last DSL, we sort of had whether documentation is a good thing or whether it's a bad thing, and there are many different opinions on that, and they started a bit of a Twitter conversation, and I am living for that. So there is some really good content out there on how to do good documentation, and for anyone who's super interested in it, come and see me and I can guide you directly to someone who is fantastic when it comes to documentation. If you've been to DSL before, you know me, I always plug things left, right and center, so if there is a resource, I'll make sure you're aware of it. So I'm moving over a little bit to accessibility that you were talking about. So you mentioned that the approach. So from a cost perspective, I guess this is not necessarily an actual figure, but you know, how much do these accessibility approaches add to the project, just to understand if it's a cost or if it's a lack of knowledge, which may be why some people are not focusing on it?
I think it's important to change like the mindset about like working on accessibility. If you think about the cost, it's like probably kind of like already too late. Accessibility ideally should be like baked in, and should be having something accessible is not about just code, it's about design, it's about content, it's about like the company as a whole and the product as a whole. So if you think about that from the beginning, probably the cost is not that like massive, just because first it's spread in different team and it's spread towards the time and becomes part of the normal routine. You know, if you have a website and you're building like a website, no one says, oh, what's the cost of keeping the website up? Like the website stay up, that's your product. And if we change our mindset about that, I think we will like think in a different way. And obviously, you know, think about the other side. There might be costs that you would incur if your product is not accessible, and let's say you're on the US market where actually it's a legal requirement, and then you can get a massive fine to pay. So maybe think about that. So I think the cost that will cost you if your product is not accessible. So like reframe the old concept in a way.
And potentially a false economy to think that it's a cost that they can't bear. Yeah. Have you guys sort of had any issues with trying to get accessibility? I mean, obviously you fairly mature system. How is that working for you guys?
So we do have accessibility best practice baked into our products, which obviously then different consumers can use. But yeah, it's absolutely right. It should be seen as not like what's the cost. It's like, well, it should be for everyone, right? And overall, that'll benefit everyone, not only using the system, but the end user, which is the most important thing. So.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, when you start a new project or you're at the early stages, then you should definitely include accessibility as part of anything that you sort of have as your basis. But you could potentially run into problems for a product that already exists or a website that isn't currently today, but they sort of need to make that change. How you mentioned about, well, we talked about the false economy and the things that can happen if they don't do it, but how do you support teams who sort of still don't really understand the importance?
I think, like, if we're talking about design system, the fact that you can achieve so much just like working on the components that you control in a way can actually remove the, let's say, the stress from other teams to actually, oh, I'm using this component, do I have to do any work to make it accessible? If actually you present it already with accessibility like baked in, and you explain also, like, you know, talking about documentation, in your documentation maybe you explain why it was built in a certain way and the accessible reason behind it, you kind of like, you give less work for the other developers while at the same time you educate them, and then, you know, accessibility is something that will stay in their mind probably, you know, for a long time and for the best.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna jump, this is what was happening in the Q&A, we jump from one topic to another because that's how the questions are seen, and we love that. So all of you spoke about tools that you're using. Are there any specific tools that you would recommend for creating style guides and component libraries? Figma is always mentioned. There are other tools potentially. So have you guys got experience of other tools that you would recommend?
For example, Zero Heights, I've heard that's very good. You're also more than free to just make simple web pages. Again, Jira, you know, just using Confluence pages. It really depends how in-depth you want to do it and how much effort you want to put into it.
Yeah, I would say we at Mews, we use Figma and we use Zero Height. We quite like it. And then, as I was saying during my talk, like, we use Storybook for actually like presenting the components for the other developers, and all those tools, like, they work like quite well, like within each other. Like, they will like kind of like do something that the other one doesn't. So it's quite like a nice flow to, like, you know, Figma is for designers, Storybook is for the developers, let's say, and then the documentation, it's something in between that is for all. For example, in our documentation, you can go straight to the Storybook or straight to the Figma. So it's kind of like the entry point, and then people can go wherever they want based on what kind of knowledge they're trying to gather.
Yeah, not to totally copy what he just said, but if you go on newskit.co.uk and you go on any one of the component pages, we do have buttons out to storybook scenarios, code as well, viewing GitHub. So yeah, we use Figma to create designs. But yeah, it's really important, obviously, for engineers to see in the documentation things like props and overrides, best practice. So we have like a mix between design and dev. But yeah, engineers sometimes just want to get to Storybook, and we make sure that we surface those all in like one place.
Excellent. Cool. I'm actually glad to see that quite a lot of designers are kind of getting into Storybook as well. So I think that's pretty awesome. Just staying a little bit. So just staying a little bit with accessibility before we move over to a little bit about more research. What's the level of accessibility that we should aim to as an open source contributor?
As I mentioned in my talk, like, we at Mews, we're aiming for 2.1 AA. That's, as far as I'm aware, it's kind of like the legal requirement in a way. And then I think that covers you like enough in terms of, especially if you want to open source your design system, because, you know, can be used for multiple scenarios in multiple industry that maybe, you know, can create some, you know, legal issues. And I think that's the one that you should use at the moment. I think the new version is coming out soon, but I don't think it's out yet. And even when it comes out, I think would be required after a bit. There's a bit of period of transition. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the standard. So we get like 2.1 AA.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to move over to, we're going to talk a little bit about research and maintaining cross-platform design systems. So this is for all of you. Have you got any ideas of keeping up with the day-to-day? We're going to start with the day-to-day feature. So obviously most of you are probably familiar with this. You try to run a product or create a product, and at the same time, the team is also trying to create a design system, because many companies don't have a separate design system team. So what are thoughts on keeping up with the day-to-day feature work whilst trying to maintain a design system, especially if it's a cross-platform design system? any of you can jump in again. I know they're so eager to ask that question, answer that question.
I can go first.
Go for it.
Well, at Mews, like we have a proper design system team, it's like 10 of us, but we obviously work for other developers in the team, so we tend to get requirements from them, and we try to kind of like each sprint that we work on to have like half, like we try to implement a new functionality that gets required from other teams, and at the same time we try to kind of like improving the components that we already have, and maybe like working on toolings or experiment on new stuff, and create like some MVP and stuff like that. So we try to like keep ourselves happy in the team while make the other people in the rest of the company also happy about using the components that we build for them.
Yeah. So we do have different features, different products that we build with MewsKit. So we have our components, but we also have mobile, as you maybe would say, products like Checkout and Help Hub as well, which is like a Q&A, FAQ sort of section. So yeah, the idea is we do have component requirements that come in, and we sort of try and see if there's the same sort of issues or the same sort of requirements from different teams, and then we sort of prioritize those components, and then we offer these more fully fledged end-to-end sort of products as well. So.
And Mitchell, have you sort of have experience of trying to keep up with one thing whilst also doing the other thing?
That's the life of a developer, really. So I would say, again, it depends on the maturity of the design system. That's a real important factor. I mean, it's impossible to do a big bang kind of approach to here's our design system, implement it everywhere. So as long as you're doing it incrementally and you make these communicable changes and you make it in a way which everyone is on board with them, it makes life easy. And you don't have, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So obviously a business case changes, but for the most part, treat it as something that you want to have as a long-term goal. So do it here and there when you can, and don't try to rush it.
Okay, brilliant. So let's take that to one harder level. That was as if that wasn't hard enough. So somebody has got a great question. Any thoughts on suggestions for creating and maintaining a global design system across native mobile, iOS, Android, as well as web and big screen devices, TV? Now, this is someone that has a challenge ahead of them. I would say really push your company to try to get a separate design system team. That's probably a good way to try to really argue why that would help everybody. But yeah, so how do we sort of support, again, everyone everywhere at the same time?
I would say, yeah, focus on the broader sort of needs, obviously. That's probably a given. But in terms of like mobile, we do have a couple of different products over on like Talk TV and different sorts of media brands, and they do have like more of a need for mobile, so that's something we want to try and expand into. I know we've done a little bit of digging here and there and trying to figure out how we support those, but yeah, as you say, having a dedicated design team that can see the bigger picture, and you can sort of tie that to other team needs as well. So say if you do want to support a set of iOS or Android specific components, then can that be used by as many teams as possible, and hopefully you can sort of gather all that together. So yeah, having one central team. Sorry to steal your thing.
Absolutely not. I mean, that clearly means that I said something right, so I appreciate it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, similar scenario. We actually have a web design system and a mobile one. The web it's built in React and TypeScript, and the mobile one is built with Flutter. Works for both Android and iOS, and we have actually a mobile developer as part of the design system team. So for us, it's working quite a lot because he's always involved with any kind of like discussion that he's making, and he works with designer. Even if then he goes and builds like components that are completely different for ours and they live like in a different storybook, the fact is like, it's not like we build a component and we give it to him and we say, oh, now you build the mobile version. Like we kind of like think together, and he will have like his own ticket and we have our own tickets for the web, but it's always since the beginning. And that means like, if the components used are different, they look exactly the same and they act in the same way. And yeah, for us, it's been quite good in terms of like having someone involved from kind of like a mobile developer as part of the team.
So I believe, mobile, web, TV, they should be their own experiences. You're focusing on the why, like why you're doing something. And so my experience is like, if you're making a mobile application, a lot of times the feel should be similar, but you shouldn't try to make those components look exactly as they do on the web. You'll always end up with discrepancies. There is things like React Native Web, which allow you to do both React Native and web. As an example, obviously there's other technologies out there, but it always ends up that you're going to have these changes, these discrepancies. So focus on the experience more than trying to get those things aligned. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's super controversial, to be honest. I think it's a fact.
Yeah, I was expecting something more controversial.
Yeah, like native only or something.
But yeah, exactly. Like something really controversial. No, I think that makes total sense, and I agree. I think that sometimes we can be a bit too obsessed that it has to look identical across various devices, and some devices you don't do some things on, so you might want to ask yourself, is it needed that this is available on every single device? So yeah, no, all of us here I think agree, Mitchell. So not controversial. Well done.
Great.
Thank you. We are still looking forward to that really controversial point at some point during this evening. It's going to come from someone, I'm sure. So, okay, so quick question here. So design people and dev team. Oh, I love that. Just forming is fantastic. Maybe this is the controversial question we will. Design people and dev teams speak different languages. Any advice about this? Yes, I feel like you immediately.
Well, as I mentioned, we have about 5, me being 1 designer in our team, and we've got more engineers. So we have shared daily stand-ups. So we share a Kanban board. Our tickets match the overall sprint. We join tech analysis as well, and like grooming sessions. So we go through the tickets. So we have more of a deeper sort of understanding of what's going on. Obviously, we're not engineers, but it's more of trying, as I mentioned before, trying to sort of bridge that gap a little bit.
Yeah, I think we do the same. And at the beginning, having kind of designers join the planning session, they were like, oh, while we're here, you're just estimating your tickets for developers. But having them there is kind of start this conversation that you can have, because at the end, you're building UI components, so there's a design elements in there, and the fact that a designer is there while you're estimating, then okay, you're here, so what do you think about this? How do you think, is this ready? How long do sometimes I think the communication is broken because you receive a piece of design and you're supposed to implement it, and then something is missing, something is clear, so you go back to the designers, can you explain to me? And then the estimation goes off, and it's always at the end when you do a retro, people complain, it's oh, this took longer than expected. So I think treat everyone equally, in the sense everyone can actually have an input and help each other out. I think it's quite important. And maybe in some meetings you're not as useful than in other meetings, but the fact you participate first, that means you're part of the team, and I think it's more inclusivity. And second, you kind of make collaboration as a kind of a de facto way of working together.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically what your talk was about, Mitchell. So,
yes.
For those of you who are still asking, do rewatch Mitchell's presentation. Actually, I would like to add something else on top of that. And I think that, first of all, I don't think that we should be afraid of, as you say, having joined stand-up, I think is super important, because as soon as you not have that, you're starting a division already. And once that division starts, then it's very difficult to all of a sudden go but we all have to come together. So that I think is great. I think there's also stuff outside the work. So in some projects where we try to do a coffee morning on a Monday, where we actually get the team together and we don't talk work. And what people realize is that, it turns out designers are just normal people. And so are engineers, and they actually can communicate with each other. So that's actually helped us on a couple of projects to just sort of, let's talk less design and engineer, and let's just talk about what people did on the weekend, or what they're planning on doing this week, or what the project is looking like in general. And having those I guess those project events as well, like the not just the stand-up, but actually the planning, the retro, making sure that everyone actually participates in that. So it is a sense of we are one team and we all have the same goal. And sometimes we don't always understand what the other person is talking about. And you know what? That's actually okay. And one other thing I would say as well is encourage people to attend things like conferences or meetups. I mean, maybe there is a meetup near you that you should encourage everyone to attend to. I'm not sure. Or even things like internal learning and brown bags and stuff like that, and actually make sure that even if you don't understand what that person is talking about, you get an understanding of what it's in the vicinity of their work. And I actually think that can really, really help that communication. So yeah, we tried that and that has been quite successful. So that's my contribution. Still nothing controversial. So I don't know why. I feel like I'm now obsessed looking for the controversial. I'm going to stop doing that. So for the testing, are there any tips you can provide on the format of questions that you guys, how you formulate questions to yield, well, more honest results? I'm not going to say better, more honest results.
Yeah, so normally tend to give a bit of an example to start with, saying examples in the past have included things like documentation or support or components, something really specific or something quite general. And I think it's more, I was talking to someone the other day in the team and we were saying survey results can tend to be quite forgiving, weirdly. Whereas in person, if you try and disarm it a little bit and say, this isn't going to come back on you, this is just so we can improve, you tend to get more honest feedback. So that doesn't mean it's going to be bad, but it means that it's generally more honest and useful. That's what we're looking for. So
yeah. And from your experience of how to make sure that we get sort of the most honest result or answers as possible?
Yeah, I think back to what I was saying, we organized these office hours, and initially people, they were like, oh, why I'm joining this? There's nothing specifically I want to talk about. But then we started to actually kind of go around the company and just oh, you're just new designer, just join, come to the office hours. And actually, because they're new, they tend to ask more honest question, and then you get something more honest from them. People just oh, I seen this design for the first time. I don't think it works that well, And then I think if you're just a newbie, then you feel more, say, oh, I don't know more about this. If you've been in a company for ages, just accept that something is like that, and you never question the status quo anymore. So trying to be proactive and try to have as many people as possible with kind of coming from different background and also a different seniority in the company, different experience, to come and share with us their opinion about whatever, even if they sometimes we're product manager coming to the meeting, they never use the design or the code, but they just see the product build with our components, and they say, oh, why there's something like this or something like that. So I think that's a good way to kind of sense the pulse of I guess the customers and the user of the components and the design system.
Yeah. Any comments from you?
I'll add one comment. Your first line of defense of a design is your developer. He'll be the first person to try it out and actually look at it. So really take on board what they say, because a lot of times they won't sugarcoat it.
Yeah, and you know what? Sometimes we need as designers, so it's good. Sorry, I had a question here. So it was such a good question. Now I lost it. Okay, here we go. So you guys talk about scoring when you do your testing. Mm-hmm. So what's the kind of lowest score before the team jumps into action regarding that satisfaction tracking?
So to do with related to the NPS score?
I would imagine that's because it's related to what you were talking about.
Yeah, so we use that to keep an eye on any attractors, detractors, and we can sort of break it down and see generally which sort of teams or job titles, that sort of thing, sort of job roles people have. So if it dips below a certain point, there isn't a bell, I don't know anyway, that goes off and said, look at this, but we do keep an eye on it. It's not a thing that we're checking once a month. We're actively sort of checking it. More of our product people are doing that and keeping an eye on that. And yeah.
Okay, so building on that, we still hanging around the feedback. So we talked about yielding their honest answers. We talked about low scoring. So what's the setup or framework for dealing with difficult feedback? And this is not just for you, this is actually for all of you. Dealing with difficult feedback from users, and I'm going to assume here that we're talking designers and engineers, we're talking design systems, or feedback that you didn't necessarily agree with. How do you deal with that?
So if it's in the form of a survey, it's maybe a little bit easier because it's a bit far removed, and you can maybe look at it a bit more of an objective sort of view. If it's in something like a consumer interview or you're just having a chat with someone, I think it's try and take your own opinion out of it. I try to, I obviously know bits and pieces here and there, definitely not on the engineering side of things, but just try and listen to what they say, take that note, and then maybe I don't think it's an important thing, or maybe I don't agree, but there are many other people in my team anyway that are knowledgeable in different areas, so maybe they do. So it's worth just sharing it.
Absolutely.
I would say first any feedback I think is good feedback. Obviously, if it comes with respecting each other. For us, what we realize when people in Slack or during our office hours, or even people they open a ticket, we have a Jira board, and actually people can assign ticket to our design system team. Usually, even if we receive a quite harsh feedback, it's oh, this doesn't work, this is broken, or this doesn't do what it should do, it's because there was a problem with the documentation. The component probably was offering the kind of requirements that were required, but for some reason was our fault to not express those kind of requirements and the possibility of this component from both a design and kind of development point of view. And some people, you have to try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's trying to implement some components and then they don't work, they get frustrated. It's and then I don't know, project manager goes to them and is oh, why is taking you so long to build this page? It's oh, this component doesn't do what I want to do. Usually it's because there's something in documentation that is missing. And then try to get the feedback in the most positive way as possible and implement the documentation and just again, build a better relationship with the other people in your company.
Yeah.
Well, this one's quite a good question, actually.
No, it's okay.
So from an engineer developer point of view, I think a lot of engineers maybe don't quite attach themselves to the design. So when the designer's giving them, they'll give the feedback very honestly, and it might be a bit abrasive. So if you're an engineer, maybe think about the emotions and the fact that people probably have put in a lot of work to make that design work. There have been cases where I've had to implement something that I very much disagreed with. And it was very hard actually to work on something because you end up a bit disheartened with the product you're building because there's a lot of heart in there as you build something. And it's important to, what they've said is to take it on board and take on board that maybe other people have other opinions, other decisions. I think engineers find it a bit hard to disengage from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably something that both designers and engineers share. You do tend to get attached to work sometimes, and I think it's in the same way that you're looking at, is this not my opinion? So make sure you step away. It's actually also learning how to not get too attached to your work. As in, yeah, of course, you should be enjoying what you're doing. You should be proud of it. But it isn't your actual baby. And if it has to go out with the dishwater, it has to go out with the dishwater. That's just the way it is sometimes. And that's a tough lesson. So we have another question around this. And if you feel like you've already answered this in the previous one, I will accept that, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So how do we test, I wonder, how do you test the user friction and how that input gets materialized? I guess it is a little bit different, but tough one.
Yeah.
Might have to come back to it.
I might say I think what I just said before, the fact that in our case, anyone can just open a bug and just assign to us, then when we check our bugs as frequently as we can, and when we realize that actually multiple people from different teams that end up opening the same bug about the same issues, then we realize okay, that's something it's not a one-off, because sometimes we get a bug and we say no, this is not a bug, there was a decision that was made, and this might create some friction for you, but the component was designed and developed in a certain way, and the documentation should explain to you the reason why. But sometimes when we see multiple people complain about the same things and saying, oh, this is very difficult to use, then obviously the friction materializes in a way that's okay, like this is creating a problem not just for like an individual person in the company, but for like multiple teams, and that you have to act in a way, and maybe we invite them to explain, in a meeting why they find it difficult, because sometimes opening a bug and a ticket can be very difficult to understand what they mean. Maybe they put a screenshot or like a video and just like, okay, but what actually the real issue here? And maybe you can find, an agreement. You have a conversation and you agree in the middle ground. I will change something and then you implement like in this different way.
I'm gonna jump in here with a really random question. So this is what happens every time we get someone who asks something really random. So I'm assuming this is a question to you, Mike, and you do not have to answer it. But have you taken the background image from the Matrix movie?
Oh,
Probably it was random.
I'm not sure which one.
Oh, so there you go. Whoever asked that question, I hope you're happy that we did spend time to get that answered. So, how do we rationalize? We're back on documentation again. Oh, I love this. How do you rationalize the balance between short, concise documentation and the need to cover edge cases? Mitchell, I'm going to pass this to you first because you were talking about edge cases in your presentation, and give these guys a bit of an extra moment to think.
Oh, that is quite a good question. I would say, it's not necessary to cover those in your style. That's not what it's for. Cover them in your foundational components. So, for example, when I mentioned there about, a button, or if you have too much text, what happens, that's where you want to comment and say, this button's for an overflow. Yeah, so I don't think it needs documentation.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have our storybook. So we do have different scenarios, our components that we tend to offer. I'm sure it's not unique to our design system. Try to gather like best practice for the different teams and stuff that are using it. But yeah, we do have some examples in storybook to cover some of those edge cases. I mean, it's kind of hard unless you have a relationship with those different teams, so you can sort of hear if there's any particular issues that they have, and then maybe you can look to address it generally. But yeah, we try to put different versions, different behaviors, different variants, and list those on storybook.
Yeah.
I will add, there's something like I've seen in a lot of like documentation for the Dazn system to have like the do column and the don't column that actually explain, how a component should be used and why not, in what case. And I think that having this kind of like two columns with different like scenarios can actually help users to understand why the component is done in a certain way, how it should be consumed and how it should be implemented, and then can bring down the amount of questions that someone might have. Is like, oh, because you explain like the edge cases, you explain like the different things, and that can be quite helpful. Another thing I would say maybe it's to have like different documentation for different targets in a way, like you can have like, your design tab and your developer tab, and maybe the two different type of users, they want to know about different things. So you can kind of like, target documentation more like for the right people, in the right space on the page.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I agree. And I also think that everything doesn't actually have to go in the design system or the style guide sometimes. Like sometimes we're in situations, I think you touched on this. Like if it's an edge case, does it have to be in there? I mean, yeah, it should be represented somewhere, but it could be an explanation rather than it has to be part of the design system or the complete style guide. Jumping back and forth because this is how we love it. So I guess this is very much a question for, do you ever use any whiteboarding apps to communicate with designers, or do we find you on a Fig Jam board or a Miro board or any kind of whiteboarding sessions?
Sure. So, okay. So yeah, very helpful. Figma has a commenting functionality. It's really nice. You both jump on it, you can talk, and basically you can quickly like pinpoint the different things and leaving comments. That's very, very useful. In terms of whiteboarding, if you're in person, obviously that really helps. But in general, a lot of people are working remote first. So yeah, something like Figma where you can actually comment as you go.
Yeah, Figma for sure for kind of like collaboration between designer and developers, and If you then, once you move, from the design phase, say you actually into the development phase, and you're starting to build a component, what we find very useful in my team is like all the engineers like to kind of like sit together remotely, because we're remote, like, maybe do a VS Code collaboration and just like build the component without the design first, just like, get all the properties out, get all the functionalities, build something that doesn't look at all what it should look, but at least like you have the kind of like the development needs and requirements in place, and they all agreed between the different like developers. So then it means also when one of the person in the team end up actually building the final component and the other people are reviewing the code, they actually are aware of how the code should look like, what kind of options should have, when you click a button, what should happen, how many variants, all this kind of stuff. So like make a decision altogether instead of just like, sending a developer to his own journey to actually build a component from scratch.
Great, awesome. So, sorry, we have a lot of questions and I'm looking at the time, and I think we should try to squeeze in a few more because there's some really good questions in here. So, what are your thoughts, since we're talking about, I guess, whiteboarding? So, it's kind of a link here. I'm going to make this a link. So, what are your thoughts on free-form design versus the structure that comes with design systems? If there is too much structure, do we lose creativity? So the reason why I think this is a super interesting question, because this is something that comes up often. Are design systems stopping us from being creative? I have an opinion on that, but I'll let these guys answer first. So how are you feeling? Free-form design versus the structure?
I don't think it has to be at all, especially if you have a robust library in something like Figma, to build out stuff, as long as things can be themed. We use different Figma tokens plugin. We're starting to sort of use that so that it can be easier for designers to use the same components and break them apart. There's also local design systems as well, so they can take individual pieces like buttons and what have you and combine them into their own component. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I will add also I think a design system is not like like something that you have to respect and admire, never trying to change or like improve. Like contribution is quite a massive part of design system. Like if you as a designer, you feel too constrained about the option that you have, maybe you can, present like a different theme or a different way of how a component is designed, do some research, like present the case, and, in a good like situation where the design system team is mature enough, like obviously the input from people from outside the team are usually like the best input, because obviously you spend day in and out inside your components and they kind of like see the other side, so they can actually help you quite a lot. So if you're frustrated, like, maybe it means that you can improve it.
So my point of view is, make it very structured. And when you need to make it custom, open it up, allow that change. Because what you don't want happening is everything's custom and then your whole experience is a mess. It just makes life easier.
So I would actually say that I think it kind of depends on, if you're looking at the design system as a starting point of a concept, then in my opinion, I think you're potentially taking not the best approach. Because if you start with a design system as the way to guide you for your concept, then yes, you can be limited. But actually, design system is there to support what you have already created. It's not necessarily, okay, we need to make a new product, let's do a design system and then create the product. You are making designs, and as a designer, you should feel free to be as creative as you possibly can. Then the design system is a tool to help you. How do we now take this design and make it something that communicates well what needs to be done, and allow a team to understand how to build it and how can we replicate it. So when people, for me, it's always like, well, that's because you think that design system is the starting point. And in my opinion, it isn't. Be creative, have a concept, and then see how design system can support that concept rather than the other way around. And that way, I think that you can feel less inhibited by your creativity or by the design system to kind of stop your creativity. So we are over on UX manager perspective. So I'm not sure, I might have missed, is anyone here as UX manager? Okay, so let's just say from a UX perspective, I'm going to cut the manager. From a UX perspective, are either of you aware about the technical processes user interactions can imply? I ask as a developer. I feel like I'm being trolled, but
I'm really trying to follow.
yeah, me too. Do you know what? Let's put that in the maybe later pile and move on to another one, shall we?
Okay.
Or unless we have that person here and they feel brave enough to give us a further explanation.
Well, I want to try and answer.
You want to?
But I can't. I can't quite understand.
No, I
The intention's there. The intention's
100% intention, hence why I'm reading it out. But you know what? Let's talk about how we can involve other people in the design process. So, why not involve people with a range of disabilities in the design process? Is that a much more powerful way to develop empathy and sort of respond to accessibility? Have you guys given this any thought?
I think, and I'm talking like as not like because in like my team we have like people with like disability or impediment or this kind of stuff, but like you should try to have the team and the people in your company as diverse as possible, and that will help you to first like to have people to actually can help you to understand what you should fix and what you should implement in the first place, but also like to increase the empathy because it's easier to feel empathy for someone that you see and and can be more difficult to feel empathy for someone like it's far from you in terms of like situation or whatever situation like might be there. So like, bring diversity in your team and that will increase the empathy and as a consequence will increase for sure the accessibility of whatever you're building or designing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also when you test, you should also ensure that you test with various different demographics and people of various different abilities. So you're actually not testing it with the same type of people all the time because then you're just going to get.
And like on that, like what I was saying in my talk, like the Dazn system is for the final users of your product, but also like for the people in your company that actually use your components. Like, if you're building something that's not accessible, they cannot do their job. Like you actually making the life of your colleague like difficult, and obviously this should not happen.
From your perspectives, again, I keep on referring to slightly sort of fairly mature design system by now. How do you involve people of various abilities?
So we do each sort of component that for example, that we add to the system. We have a accessibility spike where a member of our team goes away, finds general best practice from WCAG and what have you, and then broadly speaking, it's generally use of best practice, but then I guess it's more of like the application of it within the actual product themselves. So, if you mentioned before, if there was like a particular issue or something like that, making sure that, again, by speaking to people, you're aware of it. It's more, just being sort of responsive to that, listening to it. And obviously, if it's an accessibility problem, it's a big problem, and not just because you want to try and fix it, but everything should be universal for everyone. You're going to lose money if that's what you're concerned with down the line anyway. So everything should be made for everyone in mind.
Makes sense, absolutely. So I'm going to get 2 more questions and then I have a bonus question, and I'm looking forward to the bonus question because this is a good one, trust me. So we talked about the research, we talked about identifying things, and so now we gather this and we're now going to make the changes. What is a good way, or what do you consider is the best way to communicate the updates on design system components, and how to make sure that the changes are actually in fact released and not just sort of they're there, but they actually get implemented?
So we provide, royal we, I suppose, of engineers, write detailed release notes where it's anything to do with a new product, a new component, new feature update, any breaking changes as well. So we follow like major releases as well. And we try to sort of communicate that clearly as much as possible. We share it over Slack as well. And we have a regular showcase meeting as well, where we sort of present back anything new that's coming to the system. So hopefully people can start to see, those sort of more, like any breaking changes or anything like that, they can be aware of them.
Excellent.
Yeah, similar. We actually have a Slack channel just for like the design system being like release notes. So at the end of every sprint, we summarize whatever we release in terms of like design and code, documentation also about so like what we have in progress, just because we have a lot of other teams in the company, they have kind of like requests for customers and they say, oh, when is this coming out, when is it coming out? So we keep them updated also like in terms of work in progress. So actually they can say to the customer, oh, a team in the company is working on it. So, and at the same time, we release like the knowledge about something get released goes internally first. So then they can prepare the release note for the final customers and actually, they can announce something is, we're changing all the icons. I guess you don't want to surprise them. So we do that in advance internally. So then various project managers in the various team can actually then create their own external release notes in order for, their final customers to be, happy with that and be ready that something is coming.
Excellent, thank you. And how have the updates been communicated?
So as I touched on my talk, have those change logs very detailed, have that Slack channel, which is only for those updates, communicate when a change is very breaking, communicate that across the board and make it very obvious and like to the point where you're not even communicating on the normal Slack channel, you're actually communicating it in the main channel for everyone to know. Those kind of things really help. Yeah, just as I said in my talk, just package them up quite nicely.
So speaking of your talk, actually, so this is the last question. Now maybe we have reached that controversial point. So get your popcorns out, people. So this is me reading the question. So this is not me stating this is the truth. So in your talk, the impression was that designers should be careful when communicating or not communicating. Can you please explain? Is this a conflicting as we should all communicate with each other? Maybe there's a clarification rather than explanation here.
Can you repeat the question?
So I think at some point in your talk, you were talking about communication. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned something that designers should not communicate. Yes. Can we elaborate a little bit on this? Can we see maybe there was a misunderstanding here that we can just have a clarification?
No, I don't think there was a miscommunication there. I think it was, yeah.
Told you, this is what we've been waiting for.
So obviously there's a balance of communication. If your style guide is very communicates well intent purposes, you communicate less. So you want to be able to have a design where a developer looks at it and they're like, I understand it, I can go and do it. And so that's the time when you don't need to put comments because it's obvious. And it's only when it's like very custom or very like goes against the grain that you will communicate.
So basically aim to make sure that your documentation is communicating for you rather than you having to explain what you were trying to do. Okay, great. So I'm glad it wasn't as controversial. I think we sorted that one out. So this is the last question for the evening. And can I just say that this question has got the most thumbs up of all of the questions. There's a whole bunch of questions that we unfortunately didn't have time to go through, so I apologize for that. But a lot of those questions are in regards to communication, the fact that engineers are super busy. Is that not the case for designers? Yes, designers are also very busy. Everyone's very busy. But this is my favorite question I think we ever had. Who would win in a fight between designers and developers? And do you know what? This is something that we are not going to find out because there shall be no fighting. So I think that's a great question. Is it a great question to wrap up on? Well, I'm making it a great question to wrap up. So without having to prove who would win that, yes, front row is ready already. He's already got his sleeves up, ready to go. I want to thank all the three of you so much for taking the time to put together fantastic presentations and for coming here, giving them to us and answering everyone's questions. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.